With Lara Croft being officially announced to join Dead by Daylight, there's been a split in the community, as per usual with anything Dead by Daylight related, on if this chapter truly belongs in the fog, since it's not necessarily horror. Today we're going to dive into these arguments, and I'm going to give you guys my opinion on what I personally think. Kings and queens, welcome back to the second channel. I hope you're all having a fantastic day and you are doing well. So today we're focusing on the newest chapter, Lara Croft, as well as talking about some other decisions that Dead by Daylight has made in the past, such as introducing a Vecna chapter, which both of these chapters aren't necessarily horror themed, and people have been up in arms about these chapters. Now off the bat, I'm going to state my opinion. I think these chapters are fine. I think there's a lot of reasons why these chapters are fine, and I'm going to kind of dive in and talk about those ideas. And I can definitely see the perspective for those that are like, well, Dead by Daylight is a horror game and they're straying away from these big chapters, so it doesn't necessarily feel right when there's a lot of other horror chapters that they could introduce into the game. So I 100% can see that viewpoint that people have, but I want to play devil's advocate essentially and give you guys my opinions and thoughts on pretty much everything. And I think there is a lot of good significant points to be made. Now, I think it's obviously stated, but in case you still need context, Dead by Daylight has introduced Lara Croft, and previously they introduced a character like Vecna, which a lot of people weren't too happy about because it's not necessarily horror orientated, or that being its main focus slash theme. Now, a caveat to this, no matter what we really say or what we do, Dead by Daylight's still gonna do what Dead by Daylight does, so realistically, this entire conversation is a little bit pointless, but nonetheless, I want to dive into some points why I think it's actually quite a good thing that they've introduced these characters. Let's start off with the Vecna chapter. This one really got people riled up because it was more fantasy themed than anything, and people were like, this isn't horror themed at all. Why is this being introduced? And when I first heard this, I was like, it's crazy to me that people think this because Stranger Things has an adaptation of pretty much Vecna, and that's widely renowned as horror. So why can't Dead by Daylight take another concept similar to that might not necessarily be fully focused on the horror aspect of things and give it their own twist? And you know what? After looking at Vecna and seeing how fun he is and people actually enjoying the chapter, it's kind of a moot point for those that were like, well, he's not horror. Everybody loves the chapter. It was so well received. Obviously, balance-wise, there's different debates about that, but that's just balance. Talking about the chapter as a whole, people seem to enjoy it. And essentially, the same thing's now happening with Lara Croft, and for someone that is like myself that has wanted Lara Croft for such a long time, even back in 2018, I was making my alias Lara Croft and Nancy Wheeler, it really does hurt because for a lot of these chapters where I may have not known about a lot of things, or maybe I had no clue what was really going on, I was just happy for the people that essentially got this chapter. But the amount of hate that I see towards this chapter, not only for it being non-horror related, but also because it is Lara Croft, is pretty disappointing to me. So I want to start off with the first point of Dead by Daylight has been doing pretty much horror related stuff forever. They have brought in so many chapters that are horror orientated, and even with a chapter such as Alan Wake, for example, that some claim is one of the best horror games that we've ever had and is such a staple, the chapter was a flop. Let's not beat around the bush about that one. The chapter of Alan Wake was an absolute flop, and that was a horror character that was introduced. Obviously, major fans of Alan Wake absolutely loved it, but for the general public, nobody really cared about the DLC whatsoever. So bringing in that strict on horror type of character didn't necessarily work this time, which goes to show that just because something is horror doesn't necessarily mean it will do well. Yes, it fits, but nobody cared about it. Nobody bought it, and probably at the end of the day, it hurt the bottom line. My point being is that just because something is necessarily horror and it fits in Dead by Daylight doesn't necessarily mean it will work. So sometimes you have to expand those horizons. My next point is that there are a finite amount of horror characters that will actually work in Dead by Daylight that you can actually bring in. Apart from what actually does indeed work for Dead by Daylight, we need to remember too that a lot of these licenses are pretty much locked down and they can't be incorporated into Dead by Daylight. So at the end of the day, there is a finite amount of characters that you can add to DBD and are willing to come into DBD. So you guys might want a specific character, but chances are it's completely locked up and you can't get it. One of the best examples of this is Jason. So sometimes you do have to look elsewhere when it comes down to it. My next point about this is that if you know horror, or you know horror games specifically, you know about Dead by Daylight. At the end of the day, you have seen or heard, or at least somewhat in some fashion, seen Dead by Daylight at some capacity, even if that's from hearing about it. If you played Resident Evil and you're like, oh, they made a collab with this game I never heard of, whatever the case may be. Even when I have conversations with people in real life and they ask me what I do and I mention Dead by Daylight, most of the time if they know horror, they kind of know Dead by Daylight. They always refer to it as a zombie game for some reason, but nonetheless, they get the gist of it. They know that most of the licensed killers are there, like Ghostface. That's one of the biggest ones that people always talk about. My point being is that if you know horror, you know Dead by Daylight. So chances are, if you're a gamer, you know about Dead by Daylight already. And if you haven't touched Dead by Daylight yet, with all of these major licenses coming in, which and the numbers have kind of reflected that there really is not too much growth going on in Dead by Daylight, then as a company, you need to 100% expand your horizons and try out different chapters, because the horror audience already knows about you. You can't appeal to them anymore. It is completely saturated with horror gamers or people that have come in from some of these big licenses. So expanding your horizons, testing out different things, 100% is the right way to go if you want to continue to make the game grow. My next point is that experimentation is really good. I mean, who knows if you bring something in and then it becomes a huge hit. Look at Attack on Titan, for example. It's not necessarily horror orientated. Some might say it's more dark fantasy. And that was one of the biggest things that they've ever done for the game. So who knows what they could bring in that can actually be really good for the game. So at the end of the day, it's you separating your personal wants and your personal desires to see the bigger picture on everything. And like I said, 100% you're entitled to your opinion, and you can be disappointed that this isn't horror. But to completely, say this chapter is absolute garbage because it's not horror orientated, or get so outraged and say that you're never gonna play DBD again. I've definitely seen people saying that because it's not a character that you wanted, or doesn't necessarily fit the horror aspect, or whatever the case may be, to me is a little bit immature. And let's not forget one of the biggest points as well. There's so many aspects of Dead by Daylight itself that isn't necessarily even horror themed. Look at the Slipknot collection and the Iron Maiden collection that we got. Yes, again, Dead by Daylight did a fantastic job at pretty much adapting them into a horror type of genre and doing their own twist on things. And that's the entire point that I'm trying to make. If something remotely has some type of connection to horror, or some way, even in the sense of, Tomb Raider coming in as a survivor running around, which is literally fundamentally what's going on in Tomb Raider. She's running for her life. Then who's to say they can't do a good job in making a good adaptation and bringing it into the game? Give them a chance on it and see how it actually goes before you jump the gun and say, this is absolutely terrible and this isn't horror themed, so I hate this. The list doesn't stop there either. I mean, we have Naughty Bear, and again, yes, Naughty Bear to an extent is horror. You can even fully classify it as horror because, he's going around murdering his friends. But think about it for a second. You have a giant stuffed teddy bear running around in Dead by Daylight. I mean, come on. When you really look at it that way, I mean, does it really matter at the end of the day? Dead by Daylight's somehow going to make an adaptation, and if they do it good, they do it good. If they do it bad, they do it bad. And even if something is 100% horror and fits, such as Alan Wake, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be good. At the end of the day, them expanding their horizons is good for everything. They are essentially pulling a bunch of different audiences to come to the game. They are experimenting themselves on pushing the levels and the boundaries of what can happen in the realm of the entity, which is a good thing, because if they can do great adaptations with things that aren't necessarily super orientated, it makes sense. And the fact of the matter is, they're not going to the point where we're getting people dancing like in Fortnite or something like that. They're not going above and beyond where it completely breaks your immersion. They're still going to an extent where it still works. So it's not like this is the end of the world. DBD is no longer going to be a horror game. What's crazier to me is that everyone has always debated that Dead by Daylight isn't even a horror game at the end of the day. They said that running around from a killer and just literally doing 360s around a killer and teabagging, whatever the case may be, isn't horror orientated. And now they're complaining when a chapter isn't necessarily 100% horror themed. Nonetheless, those are the few points that I wanted to talk about. There is a ton of more that I can go into, but I think those are the major talking points that I wanted to get through. Again, these videos, they're a little bit rambly. I'm going on a tangent. Maybe I said something you didn't like, but that's what the second channel's for. I'm literally just voicing my opinion, no script, no nothing. And you know, there's probably going to be people in the comments that nitpick things that I say to make sure that, you know, their point is proven. But at the end of the day, all I'm here to say is give it a chance. Give it a chance. It might not be something that you 100% wanted, but see what it's like first. And even if this is a chapter that you don't necessarily like, you don't think it fits Dead by Daylight, don't buy the chapter. Wait for the next chapter. I'm sure they're going to do more horror-orientated things. And at the end of the day, don't forget that we have Iron Maiden skins, we have Slipknot skins, we have a giant teddy bear running around, we have a pizza delivery Dwight, we have snowmen in the game that literally walk around. The list goes on and on. I'm sure you guys can think of a lot of different things that pretty much aren't necessarily 100% horror themed in DPD. So that being said, that is pretty much going to wrap it up for this discussion video. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure to leave a like down below, subscribe for some more awesome Dead by Daylight content. And as always, I'm the King. I tip my crown to you guys, and we'll see you in the fog.